uh, we respected the words so much on MASH, and all of us had come from the theater. One day we were doing a scene out at the ranch where in the early days we didn't even have a telephone out there because 20th Century Fox didn't want to spend any money on us. They didn't know if we'd be a hit or not. So when we were out there, miles from anybody, didn't have a phone, and we couldn't get in touch with Larry Gelbart. And we needed to because Wayne Rogers and I were doing this scene, and I had to say a line that didn't make sense to me, and it didn't make sense to Wayne. And we thought, what'll we do? We can't get in touch with Larry. We can't change it without asking Larry's permission. And then we both said, well, maybe it's one of Larry's jokes that we just don't get. So I said it and tried to make as much sense of it as I could. But I didn't know what it meant. but Larry had written it, so I said it. And the next day I was watching the Rushes, sitting next to Larry, and this line comes up on the screen, and Larry turned to me, hurt, and he said, why did you say that? I said, that's what you wrote. He said, no, that was a typo. But we so much, didn't want to veer from what he had written that I even said typos. But later on, we had a phone and we could work those things out.
Now that's an incredible statement. Certainly, there's so many shows that we know about where the writer isn't respected to that point, or a star or stars will change the lines because they feel they're improving it.
Yeah.
Was the tempo of that show set starting with Gene Reynolds? The level of trust in that show?
Well, Gene Reynolds set up the level of trust in the beginning by asking us to tell him what our problems were line by line. But in addition, I think because we had all come from the theater, almost all of us, we just came in with this respect for the written word. And it's interesting. We rehearsed a lot, also because we came through. We did a lot of takes. We often did 20 takes, and television is usually done on 1 or 2 takes. But what looks like improvisation sometimes is very well rehearsed spontaneity. And it's amazing how many people say to me, well, that it looks like you guys are making it up. That's what you hope for. You hope it looks like you're making it up. But there was only one show that was improvised, and even that started as improvised moments that Larry then took. He took the transcript of those improvisations, and he sharpened it up. He selected what he wanted. He wrote his own new material, but then on camera that was a program where we were being interviewed, and it was called The Interview, and it was in black and white, and the newsman Cleet Roberts, who did a wonderful job, was interviewing us, and so he would ask us questions that we had been asked in the improvisations and that had been reworked by Larry. So we were doing things that had been created basically through improvisation, but then reworked. But then Cleet Roberts also asked us some questions on the spot that we didn't expect. So you got a mix of rewritten improvisation and spot improvisation, which was really exciting. And I wished that we had been able to do more improvisation on the show, because Larry was very good at combining writing and improvising, and you can get some really amazing stuff when you're good at doing both. And I love improvisation because the only training I've ever had, aside from the learning by experience, was improvising with Second City and in a more and a company called Compass, which I did in Hyannisport, where I played President Kennedy in a press conference, and would do an impromptu press conference every night. in front of the reporters who were interviewing him during the day. And they would be asking me questions that hadn't gotten into the newspaper yet, so I didn't even know what they were talking about sometimes. But we also did theater games. Paul,
At Second City?
yeah, we would do theater games just as a workshop, and sometimes we'd take it out and perform it in churches and union halls, or I don't know where. And that was very important to me. That was the theater games were invented by Viola Spolin. I always recommend that to actors because it changes you. It makes you, first of all, it makes you much more focused on the actor you're working with. You can't play theater games unless you're focused on the other person. And it takes you off yourself, and you're much less, if you do it right, you're much less ego-driven. You know, you're not showing off your cleverness. You're becoming part of a group. And I think all my life, becoming part of a group has been the most important part of performing to me. I feel most comfortable that way, and I love the stuff that comes out of the group. It's very exciting. It's more interesting than what comes out of a bunch of separate performances that just happen to be taking place side by side.
Was Uta Hagen's book ever used or taught as you were working Second City or
No.
later with the theater games of?
No, theater games was invented by Viola Spolin, who was Paul Sill's mother. No, Uta Hagen, I only know her work through, a cursory look at it. I don't know it very well.
Let's return to MASH in a second. I want to jump back, if we could, to the Phil Silvers show, which you mentioned. Describe Phil Silvers for us.
Phil Silvers had been a comedian in burlesque who then went on to become, he went straight, as they say, and did legitimate, he did legitimate theater. We became popular in musicals and then films, and then it was a big television star and a hilarious comedian. He was one of those people. There are only a handful of people who have, in the history of comedy, who have created a distinct character, and he did. Only one person could be W.C. Fields, and only one person could be Phil Silvers. And he was a very kind person, and tried to help me as I was starting out.
In the early '60s, you continued to balance several mediums. Actually, at that point, theater and television. A bit later.
I wasn't exactly balancing them. That was the only places I could get work at the time. Wherever I could get work, I worked.
But at that point, you preferred theater.
I did prefer theater. Yeah. I mean, I thought I would just be a stage actor. I mean, it really never occurred to me that I'd have some big success on television.
You, in 1960s, played Pearly Victorious in
Right.
two of those mediums. Tell us
Yeah.
about that.
Pearly Victorious was written by Ossie Davis, and it was a brilliant comedic parody of racism, which years later was not understood by many black people who thought that he was promoting stereotypes. On the contrary, he was skewering stereotypes. And the place used to rock with laughter. The theater would rock with laughter on those days when whole black congregations would come to the theater. I mean, they got it, and they loved it, and I loved being in that play.
And working with Ossie Davis.
Ossie was brilliant. I used to stand in the wings and watch him, and there was a long monologue he did, late in the play that went on for about 5 minutes or so. It just amazed me how he would get so caught up in it and caught up in the rhythms and the passion of it, so that he truly seemed carried away, and yet he couldn't have been totally carried away because he was so precise about it. It had he was aware of the rhythms and the articulation of his speech, and yet he was carried away on a wave of passion that was gorgeous. I used to watch my father and Sam Levine in Guys and Dolls. I watched From the Wings twice a week, Saturday matinee and Saturday evening, for 2 years. And I used to watch Sam Levine go through that. And Sam Levine was a genius. He gave a different performance every night.
Big changes or
He would
slight-
say the same words, he'd stand in the same place, but it would come out of him in a different way, and he would get laughs in different places. Big, big laughs. And if you saw it one night, you'd say, oh, that's the big laugh that he's heading for. Next night it'd be in a different place. He was so tuned in to who he was talking to and what he was going through that each moment had its own value and came in at its own pace and its own rhythm. It was a great education to Stand in the Wings.
You've mentioned a bunch of times that you stood in the wings.
Yeah.
Why the wings, not the theater?
Big difference standing in the wings. When you stand in the wings, you see where the magician puts the rabbits. When you're in the audience, you get the illusion. You don't know how the illusion is created as well as you do if you're standing sideways to them. It's just a physical thing. You can read their thoughts better. I don't just mean, now I'm not talking about magicians, I'm talking about actors. Literally about actors, you can see them pausing while the audience is laughing. You can see what they do to fill that pause to make it look like life is going on for them. You can, especially if you stand in the wings a few times, you hear how they change the performance. You can see some of that from the front, but from the side, because they're doing it for somebody else over there, you're looking at them in a private moment. You're looking at them from a perspective that's through the back window or the side window of their house. And you see things going on that you can't see in the audience, because in the audience, the audience is what the illusion is created for. You just see more from the side.
So you prefer to study the craft rather than to sit back and enjoy the show?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a professional actor, so even if I'm sitting enjoying the show, I'm watching the craft.
Is there ever a time where you turn off the analytical side and enjoy, or is that rare?
I think it's very hard for people in my profession to do that. Comedians are well known for not laughing at other comedians. Somebody says something funny and the guy listening says, funny, and that's a kind of appreciation. And there are times when you're a good audience and you laugh, but even while, like Benny is supposed to have been convulsed by Burns, George Burns. But even when you're laughing hysterically at somebody, some part of your head is figuring out how they did it. And that's a pleasure. Because it's one of the pleasures that keeps us in this business, and makes us put up with what we have to put up with in order to be able to do it. There are some rewards for some people in this business. Most people don't get many rewards, and they have to be in it for some reason. And it's not just to get up and show off their bodies or exhibit their personalities. That's a part of it. But if you get good at it, the real pleasure is in knowing how to do it well enough to get even better at it.
Taking the journey.
Yeah, to learn, I mean, you know, why do people do woodworking? It's not just because they like to make furniture, or they need a chair. They make more chairs than they need. It's because they like doing it, and they want to get better and better at it. Why do people make violins? They're trying to get some sound that is elusive, and knowing how to be believable and funny, and knowing how to make somebody feel something, and to get better and better at that, and to figure out how other people do it, and to figure out what works for them that might work for you, which is not always the case. I mean, very often what works for them only works for them, and you should steer clear of it. But even when you're the audience, you're thinking of that, I think.
There are several shows that you did in the 50s and early 60s. I just want to see if there's anything that stands out in your mind. Naked City, you were doing an episode of that?
I was acting with, sorry, it's early in the morning right now and I can't, Burgess Meredith. And he was a great actor. And it was the first time I had acted with somebody who was so thoroughly focused on who he was playing. He was playing a derelict, I think. And I would see him go off in the corner and improvise by himself before the shot. And I'd never seen anybody do that. And it really interested me to see how he got so inside the character. And he was like a kid. He was, you know, he was maybe, I don't know how old he was then, maybe he was 50, 45, 50, I don't know. But he had been acting all his life, and I thought, gee, you'd think he could just toss this off, but he's working at this with the same energy and enthusiasm he'd have if he was just starting out and wanted to get it right. It was a good inspiration for me. It's the way I work. I don't take anything for granted. I mean, I know I can be really bad if I don't work as hard as I can. And the other funny thing I found out on that Naked City was how you have to accommodate, at least you're asked to accommodate the camera at the expense of what makes sense. For instance, Burgess Meredith was much shorter than me, and I had to do is they wanted to take a shot over my shoulder to him, you know, over here to his face. Well, they didn't want to put the camera up high, they wanted to be down like this. So they said, just spread your legs and make yourself shorter while you talk to him. Now you try talking to somebody as though you really mean it, standing with your legs spread out as far as you can and, you know, bringing you down an extra foot or a foot and a half. And I did it, but when we were working on MASH, Wayne Rogers and I used to drive him to the set out in Malibu when we would do the exteriors in the mountains, and he didn't like to drive, so I drove him. And I would tell him my dreams, and and he would interpret my dreams for me. And we had like an hour drive out there, you know. So one of the dreams was about how this all gets back to what I was going to tell you about Burgess Meredith. You'll see in a minute. This dream was about how the director, we were doing a scene. He and I were acting in a scene in this dream. And the director said, just get up on the armoire there and say your line from on top of the armoire. So I did it, and I didn't like it. I felt uncomfortable. It was like standing with Burgess Meredith with my legs spread apart. And Wayne said, you know what this is? We're being asked to accommodate the camera all the time by the director, and it's getting in the way of our acting. He says, we must never do an armoire. And from then on, every time somebody'd say, just hold that a little higher so we can see it in the tight shot, you know. Wayne would say, armoire, or I'd say, armoire coming here, you know. Because the joke is, among actors who do film, that it's in the old westerns, in the wide shot. I don't know how wide this shot is if you're down. In the wide shot, they'd hold the gun here. In the medium shot, when the camera's tighter, they'd hold the gun here, and in the close-up, they'd hold the gun up here, and then they cut all that together, and you're not supposed to notice. Well, maybe the audience doesn't notice, but the actor sure notices the difference between this and this, and it's annoying. And you can't it's not, you play a scene, you relate to a person a certain way if you're like this, and then it's a whole other thing if you're like this, and that's an analogy for all the rest of acting. So there are many demands made on you that are armoires in film, much more so than the stage. I mean, on the stage, there are a couple of basic things like, unless you really want to, unless there's a reason for it, don't turn your back on the audience. Speak up. Okay, a few things like that, so which are annoying enough. But you don't want to always speak up that much. But in film, it's very mechanical. It's very peculiar. Film is a medium, I include television in this, is a medium where spontaneity counts more than anything because you can read their thoughts. The camera's right up in your face. You can't really read their thoughts on the stage because you're too far away. Even though spontaneity is that important, there are so many mechanical considerations that are thrown in your way, it's almost impossible to be spontaneous. In fact, you have to know, because a movie and a television show are shot usually, except television shows that are shot with 3 cameras, but then they do pickups, so it's the same thing. Because it's shot out of sequence, you have to intellectually know what your character is going to be like on page 100 compared to what the character is like on page 3. And you have to be able to jump from that state that the character's in on page 3 to page 100, back again to page 70, then to page 112. And you have to intellectualize this because you don't get a chance to do it all in one go. You usually don't rehearse it. And if you rehearse it, you just rehearse a couple of scenes. And as a result, the spontaneity that ought to grow out of an organic integration of all the elements of the story, the play, the characterization, the growth of the character, all of that should happen organically, has to happen intellectually, by choice, by decision. And yet, if you're not spontaneous, it shows. So there's this strange paradox in film where you have the very thing that's valued the most, the form itself works against it. Because you do it out of sequence, you come in on the fly, you just do a part of a scene. Sometimes you just do one line out of the scene, and it has to fit exactly with everything that went before and what goes after. It's very peculiar. There are a lot of barriers to good work in film.
Do you see it as an adjustment that is out of necessity by going from a theater versus film or television, or do you see it as a compromise? Once you're working in you're holding the gun up here as opposed to here, is it a compromise, or do you view it
Well,
as?
A good director actually won't require you to hold the gun up there, and a good actor will say to a director who does, well, let's think about that. Maybe that's not such a good idea, But so you might be asked to do. You will always be asked to do mechanical things that get in the way of spontaneity, or get in the way of discovering what it is rather than putting it there deliberately. I find discovery more interesting. I don't like to see performances that don't look like they're being discovered, but that look like it was all worked out the night before and I'm giving you a Xerox of it today. But you have to learn how to work around those things. It's just one of the tasks you have. You do a radio show by talking into the microphone. There's no way to do a radio show without a microphone. Unfortunately, that has led to some bad radio acting. The stereotype of radio actors is people who are consciously manipulating their voices to create some effect. You know, I used to love listening to the radio and hearing them do this. It used to make me chuckle. Like, for instance, the guy would say, "I'll just lift this up and put it on the table," you know. Well, real people don't talk that way. And if you made a recording of somebody lifting something up and putting it on the table, there might be grunts and groans, but they'd come in a whole other way than that. And the good radio actors would find a way to rediscover what it really sounds like to lift it up and put it on the table. And the others who would go from one, a lot of radio actors would do a radio show at 9 o'clock, and then they'd run across town, do another show at 11 o'clock, then they'd do one at 4 o'clock. They were working all the time, and they just did it the easy way, the stereotypical way, the cartoon way, you know.
Let me go through this list again if we could. You, I think, were in 2 episodes with the nurses.
Yeah.
Any memories on that?
No. Route 66, I remember that. I remember overacting badly on that. I think that the thing that amazed me about that was I got out to St. Louis to do Route 66, and they gave me my own hotel room. I had never been given my own hotel room before. I was so amazed at it, I danced around the room. I couldn't believe what I had here. I wish I had given a performance that was as good as the room.
Sherry Lewis show?
Oh, yes, yeah. I think I did my Kennedy impersonation on that. I called up Lamb Chop, and you heard me on the phone talking to Lamb Chop as Kennedy.
Very important children's show, would you say?
Oh, she was enormously talented, and she created really memorable characters, and she kept at it, and her later shows were very imaginative and really watchable, not just by kids, but by everybody.
In '64, you were regular on That Was the Week That Was.
Yeah.
Tell me about that show.
That was interesting. That Was the Week That Was interesting because it really did try to follow the news. And sometimes we would get a sketch a few minutes before we went on the air, and we went on the air live. I had never sung live on television for 20 or 30 million people before, and that was scary. I sometimes had to do a song, and the sketch. I remember David Frost was the host of the show, and I remember there was one sketch we had to do, and he was 2 minutes before we went on the air. He was in the bathroom in his dressing room, and I was outside the door rehearsing the scene with him through the closed door because we had never had a chance to rehearse it, and we were about to perform it live in 2 minutes. And that was exciting. I loved that. I loved broadcasting. Always loved walking through the halls of broadcast buildings and going into the studios. And I loved radio. I did radio in college on WFUV-FM at the Fordham station. I wrote and directed and acted in plays, produced them, and I'd write them on the subway on the way to school, and then I'd start producing them, and then a couple of days later we'd have it on the air.
Let me pause you there.